Good morning. I'm just going to analyse a game from Aron Nimzowitsch against Paul Jöner. It played in Dresden in 1926. Nimzowitsch won the tournament in Dresden in 1926. I'm a big fan of Nimzowitsch. He's a very different player from Paul Morphy, who I've already mentioned being a big fan of. He had his own theories, his own ideas, and his own way of playing chess. And in this game, he demonstrates one of his theories beautifully in an opening which is named after him. And yeah, it's not just for that reason that it's such a beautiful game. He also comes up with an absolutely beautiful, fantastic conception for how to launch an attack. I don't think any other player ever in history will have thought of the same plan as Nimzowitsch comes up with here. Yeah, I think we can just get started. So Nimzowitsch is playing black here. Paul Jöner is playing white. Jöner plays d4. Knight f6. Normal move. Again, normal. Maybe we're heading for a Queen's Gambit declined or some such thing. But no, Nimzowitsch plays bishop to b4, the so-called Nimzo-Indian. The Nimzo bit being Nimzo's name. And his idea is here that he will take the knight on c3, double the pawns, and then work against the pawns. And one of the books, really more of a small article, but one of the books he wrote called Die Blockade, written in German, The Blockade. In that he explains that when your opponent's got a weakness, you should blockade it, restrain it, and then attack. And the weakness that he hopes that he will create here is the doubled pawns on the C file. Then he will restrain them, stop them from moving forward, blockade and restrain, and then when everything is safe, he will find a way to create an attack himself, and this is an absolutely beautiful attack he creates. Yeah, this is a standard way of playing against the Nimzo-Indian. Queen to c2, rarely, but sometimes to b3 is played as well. This defends the knight with the queen so that you don't get the doubled pawns, but then you're developing your queen early, and there are other disadvantages that come with it. It's like with all openings in chess, there's advantages and disadvantages with everything that's played. So Nimzowitsch castles. Doesn't seem that unusual, that outlandish, but Aron Nimzowitsch was one of the players who was most responsible for the so-called hypermodern movement. And by hypermodern, we mean 100 years ago. We chess players had the hypermodernists were in the middle of the 1920s until the 1930s, so 100 years ago or so. This game is almost 100 years old, but as a way of playing, instead of establishing a pawn in the centre, attacking that centre from the wings was revolutionary, hypermodern then. So, yeah, normal developing move. And c5 is Nimzowicz's way of restraining the C pawns, the double C pawns. What double C pawns are here, you asking? Good question, but the pawn on the knight on c3 is pinned, so the bishop can take it. There are a couple of ways to treat it if they play pawn takes pawn on c5. You can take the knight anyway, and then play queen to a5, and you're attacking the pawn on c5 and the pawn on c3. But anyway, just taking it and giving the opponent 3 pawns in a row is probably enough to to compensate for the fact that you're a pawn down, but it will be impossible for white to defend all his 3 c pawns, so not a great idea to take the pawn on c5. And he doesn't, he just develops another piece. And Nimzowitsch develops another piece, puts more pressure on the centre. And now Jöner castles. And the thing is that when you've got a threat, you know, the idea said often in chess is that threat is stronger than the execution. And whilst he's threatening to take the knight and double the pawns, White had to do things that took account of that threat. But now, White can move that knight. On his next move, White can move the knight on c3, and there's no longer any threat of doubling the pawn. So it's not a case of no, that the threat is stronger than the execution, because if you wait any longer, the knight will wriggle out, and your bishop then is just standing in a dumb place, and you haven't got any grip on the centre at all, and things aren't looking good for you. So, taking all that into account, Nimzowitsch takes the knight on f3, at c3 even. And now the pawns are doubled. Great. And now that the bishop isn't defending the pawn on c5 anymore, he defends it with the d6 pawn. This pawn is very important to Nimzowitsch here, because it stops these pawns from moving, and at the same time it means that this bishop here on c1, if it comes here, it doesn't have any new moves, it's just a big pawn. If it comes here, it only has one new move, which is here, which is a pretty useless diagonal with a pawn there, or it can go back where it came from. So this restraint doesn't just keep the weakness, the double pawns fixed in place, it really works strongly against the bishop on c1. So yeah, so he supports the pawn for that reason. Here Jöner wants to play knight to b3, and it doesn't really matter that he's blocking in that bishop, because that bishop has no prospects. So why does he want to play the knight to b3? It's because in this position, in this type of position, Nimzowitsch was known for, at times he would play the pawn to b6, the bishop to a6, and the knight to a5 to attack the pawn on c4 3 times. And the queen couldn't then come and defend it. It would be difficult to get it defended properly, so it might well easily get overwhelmed. So he's playing the knight here so that he can then play the knight here to b3, so that it has influence over a5 to stop the knight coming there. And Nimzowitsch quickly supports his important c5 pawn again. Not really his plan. And now he's happy to play e4, e5. He's threatening to play e4 and block that bishop in as well. And if he gets e4 in this position, then, you know, that bishop looks really, really poor. That bishop looks really, really poor. And these knights look really, really good. He's also doesn't mind if the pawn gets pushed, because then the centre is blocked off, and that makes this blockade of the c pawns stronger. And if he takes, he can probably take with the pawn, and then, you know, got a nice open centre. And again, the bishop looks pretty silly there, but that doesn't happen. He plays f4 with the idea of taking twice on e5, opening up the centre in an advantageous way. And in order to keep restraining and to have an attack, it's important for Nimzowitsch that things remain blocked up in the centre and indeed on the queen side. And so he plays e4 to keep the centre closed. And then if e5 ever comes, the centre is really closed, and that's to his advantage. And now he plays queen to d7. to have influence over the d4 square, at g4 square even. If he hadn't played queen to d7, then Jöner might have been able to play bishop to c4. No, not just yet. He would have to play pawn to h3 first, but, you know, influence over the g4 square. But there's also an incredibly clever conception behind this move d7 that just, you know, is stunning. So, now he's threatening to play bishop here, swap off, and if everything gets swapped off, and on g4, you know, if he plays bishop here, and the knight takes, and the queen takes, and the queen takes, and the bishop takes, the pawn takes, well, apart from black losing a piece, positionally it's very bad for black, so it looks to restrain that plan. So he comes back with the knight, so that he's now threatening to come to knight to f5, maybe eventually to g3. Then he will have a real strong positional grip. So white Jöner plays queen to e1 to transfer his queen to the queen side, thinking that he's going to get to the king side, thinking that he's going to get a king side attack. So Nimzowitsch plays h5 to exert pressure on g4, and to maybe, if he gets the chance to play maybe knight to f6 and knight to g6 and or f5 and pawn to h4, getting a real clamp on the centre. And we've still not seen the clever little plan. I don't understand the point of playing the bishop there, but what else is he going to do? What else is he going to do? You know. Queen to f5. Does this make sense? You know. Okay, he's defending the e pawn one more time, and he's defending the h pawn one more time. But you know, is it such a good active square for the queen? Not the best, but he finds a fantastic active square. This is to support the h3 pawn in case of sacrifices. And now comes the brilliant conception. I'm just going to have a drink of my tea whilst you sit back and admire that fantastic, wonderful and weird move. If you were to wander into a chess club one evening and see this position on the board and take a casual glance at it, you'd think, oof, black has his queen in a really funny and awkward place. But it's a brilliant place. It's on the same file as the king. So he's got an attack against the king. It defends the pawn on e4 and the pawn on g4. It means that at all times, at the moment, there are two defenders for that pawn which isn't yet attacked. It's important for black to keep hold of that pawn, at least for now. So having an extra defender, overprotection, another principle written about in Nimzowicz's fantastic book, My System, is demonstrated well here. If you just keep putting protectors on a piece which isn't yet attacked, then you might think, well, I'm wasting my time defending something that isn't being attacked. But what it means is that you have use of the square that you're defending, you have use of squares behind it, and you have use of open lines. So overprotection can be a very useful thing to go in for. And here, the overprotection is part of the beauty of this game. So he plays a5. Maybe he's thinking of playing a6 and breaking open the pawns and creating some counterplay on the queen side. So you might think, okay, Nimzowitsch now has to play a5 to restrain the queenside expansion from white. But he plays knight f5, and it's best Because now he's threatening to play h4 and then come in with the knight to g3 and get a real strong positional grip. And so he has to play g3. And now he can play a5. And the queen side is at the moment completely blocked up. And a thing worth remembering as an attacking player, apart from the fact that you have to make your position solid before going to attack, is that if I'm going to attack on the king side, as Nimzowitsch is here, then I don't want things wide open on the queen side, because suddenly a counter blow comes in from nowhere on the other side of the board and I don't know what to do about it. So this move is to make sure that that counter blow doesn't come. A prophylactic move. Okay, defends the pawn with the rook. Can't argue with that. Yeah. He's threatening now to play knight to g4. And then say check, and if he takes with the pawn, then he takes with the pawn and says check with the queen. And then comes here with the queen, then comes here with the queen, and you know, white's not long for this world if that happens. So he puts some more protection on both the h3 pawn and the line, the diagonal here. He threatens the pawn on a4 to keep the rook from doing anything more constructive. It's possible that he wants to play knight to e2, maybe queen to e1, maybe queen to b3 to attack the pawn on b6. Yeah, those kind of things. But, you know, when the bishop's shuffling back and forward between d2, where it's a big pawn, and b1, where it came from and stands in the way of the two rooks uniting, it's not a good sign. It is not a good sign for poor Jörner. So this looks like just a sensible middle game idea. I'm going to put my rook on a better file, and it is a sensible middle game idea. But it also contains the threat that if he takes the pawn, then this rook is then already standing on a half open file and creating an attack on the weakened doubled pawns, which he intended to go to attack with, back on his fourth move, third move, bishop to b4. Now, 17 moves later, he's intimating the first attack against these weakened pawns. You know, great, conceptually brilliant. So this more or less forces White's hand. He's more or less forced to play d5, making sure that the centre is thoroughly blocked, that there isn't going to come a effective counter-attack on the queen side. Yeah, so without the effective counter-attack on the queen side, then Nimzowitsch can go to attack on the king side. And he's got all the time in the world. Since his opponent can't do anything about it, he can slowly move the rook to g1, g8, move the pawn, move the rook to g7, move the other rook to g8, and break open one of the files, g or h, and get it to the opponent's king. Yeah, knight attacks the pawn. But as I said before, it's double defended by the queen and by the knight. If, for example, he does something like bishop to d2 to attack the pawn again, it's already double defended. It's over protected. So, doubles the rooks. It begins the process of doubling the rooks. Attacks the pawn again. He wants an open file. Of course he does. How do you get an attack? You open up files or diagonals. And that's to protect the pawn on g3. But it is virtually impossible for him to hold the position together. And as I said, he just slowly doubles up the rooks. Plays knight to f5 first, meaning there's one less defender for the pawn now because the queen's in the way. But one more attacker for the weakened g3 square. And this becomes a powerful threat. Or indeed, this becomes a powerful threat. It's difficult for a Yeoner to deal with both of those threats. But bishop, yeah, it's a reasonable move. It allows this rook to defend g3 and it allows this rook to defend the whole of the second rank, but particularly the g2 square. But this is no ideal setup for white's pieces. I know I spoke before about if you came into the club, you might look at black's queen and say, "Oh, that's a weird and awkward position for the queen." But you would probably have been wrong in that case. If you came into the club one night and saw this position, you'd think, "Oh, white doesn't look so very good. His pieces are a right mess there." And this time you'd be right. His pieces are a right mess there, as you can see from the score in the evaluation. So, the rook doubling is achieved. And now, an attack on the pawn, but more importantly, white is thinking of playing queen to b3 to attack this pawn. But Nimzowitsch just takes it. He can't take with the g pawn because the rook on g1 falls. So now suddenly, on top of all the other advantages he's got, black has a passed pawn. Is he going to do something with that? Well, he plays a bishop to c8. Completely unnecessary. He could have. He didn't need to do that. The idea is that if white comes to b3 to attack the pawn on b6, then black can come to a6 to attack the pawn on c5, c4, and then when he takes the weakened doubled pawn which he created on his fourth move, then he will be attacking at the same time the rook and the knight. And even although it would be possible for the rook to move to defend the knight, then he just needs to take, and then this pawn here is going to collapse. The whole position is therefore going to collapse. So Yeoner won't be able to play queen to b3 and then take the pawn. Plays queen to b3 anyway, and yeah, plays the pawn to have that little idea. Yeah, and now suddenly that pawn that was saying, "Oh, it's overprotected," suddenly it's attacked by the rook and the bishop and only defended by the knight. Is he going to lose it? Well, no, because he plays a knight to h4. So that the queen now defends the pawn, and so that he's also got threats like playing knight to f3 check and then getting his passed pawn a little bit nearer to the end. Yeah. So now Yeoner restrains the passed pawn and defends his pawn, but it's not gonna end well for him. You can see it's not gonna end well for him. And Nimzowitsch realizes that actually, if he just takes this pawn, then that collapse that we've been talking about is going to occur anyway. And a third attacker for the pawn. Can he defend that a third time? Well, yeah, but does he really want to? Does he want to play bishop to f5 and defend it? Then the pawn might come, and you know. No, he's willing to abandon the pawn now to, you know, open up the king. When it is maybe more relevant when one talks about opposite side castling and attack, but you don't count the pawns, you count the open lines, and this opens a line against the king, and the king can't take on h3, because then the queen comes to f5 check, and the king can't take then on h4 because queen to g5 would be mate, so it has to go back to h2. And then the knight comes to g5 and says check. The knight can't go here because of this knight. The king can't go here because of this knight, so the king has to come here. And then this knight moves to f2 with a double check, and then eventually comes to h3 with mate. And if he takes the so he can't take the bishop because he will get checkmated. So he takes the pawn, and Nimzowitsch correctly retreats the bishop, and now you see that the file where the king is standing with the queen on the same file on the brilliant h7 is half open, so that this is a really dangerous position for black. Black is not going to survive long. So he takes it, threatens the queen, but Nimzowitsch takes, and he's threatening to take the knight as well as push the pawn, as well as maybe take the pawn on g3. It's the position is collapsing for white. So yeah, he just carries on with the attack. Doubles up the rook so that they defend one another. Takes with check. Obviously, if he takes with the double check, check with the queen, check with the pawn, so the king has to move. It can only go there. And now the queen comes in to, if the rook moves, it's going to be mate very quickly. If this rook moves, it's weak. It's coming to an end. So he threatens the knight on f4, and he comes to h4 to threaten the rook on e2, g2 even. So he tries to run away with the king, and it's the last move of the game now. And he could, of course, just take the exchange and win in that way. But no, he just does a quiet, subtle move that says, wait a minute, you're not going anywhere, mate. I'm keeping you in this little box, and you can just wait until I can get round to checkmating you. And he plays rook to e8, making the threat of queen to h1, queen to f3, etc. Queen to h1, the rook has to go here, so it can't come back. So then the queen comes here, and it's not looking good. He can probably sacrifice the rook here, and then play knight to g2 check, get a exchange, and the position is just completely collapsing. So a brilliant game by Nimzowitsch. What do we say about a game like that? Well, it could only come from the mind of Aron Nimzowitsch, a brilliant player and a strange little genius. A player I really admire. Anybody who can play queen to h7 and it be such a brilliant move, you've got to admire them as a chess player. And it just shows that the idea of creating a weakness and restraining that weakness and making your position all safe and then going to attack. It's a different way to play a game of chess. It's probably not how I play chess, but it's a great way to play a game of chess, and we can only admire Aron Nimzowitsch. Yeah, okay. Don't forget to give me a thumbs up, subscribe, make a comment, do what you can to support my channel and push me up the algorithm. Thanks. Bye.